I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm starting my next series-long video ranking project as I begin my journey replaying the Legend of Zelda series, from the original NES game up to Skyward Sword. If you want to see ranking videos for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, check the playlist link at the top of the description as I've already covered those games extensively with multiple countdowns. Today's video is ranking the dungeons of the original Legend of Zelda for the NES, and I'll be focusing exclusively on the first quest dungeons. Then tune in next week when I rank every enemy, including the bosses, from the first Legend of Zelda, as, let's be real, the bosses on their own just don't have enough to talk about to justify a full video. I am playing the first Zelda via the Nintendo Switch Online NES app, and I'll be following the ZeldaDungeon.net walkthrough because, for me, this is a game that was originally designed for you to be guided through it, though when it came out, that meant looking at the manual, talking with friends, making your own maps, checking out magazines that came with official walkthroughs. Nowadays, the work's already done, and I do love following a good ZeldaDungeon.net guide. So let's just get right into it. All 9 dungeons in the Legend of Zelda NES, ranked. And be sure to let me know your favorite dungeons in the comments. Rounding out the bottom of our list, we have what I consider to be the hardest dungeon in the game when it comes to difficulty spikes. Level 6, the Dragon. Found to the east of the Western Graveyard, this dungeon introduces what I consider to be the hardest enemies in the game, Wizrobes. They are everywhere, and while the orange variants die in one hit to a fully upgraded sword and are easy to predict, when you combine them with their blue counterparts, or the bubbles that stop you from using your sword for a short time, the experience becomes genuinely painful. After all, blue Wizrobes can just phase through you and do major contact damage without a care in the world. They feel genuinely unfair in a game of enemies that are tough yet fair to fight. Some rooms even combine the aforementioned enemies with like-likes, creating a clusterfuck of enemies to take down. We should just be blessed there are no dark nuts to add insult to injury. In terms of progression as well, this dungeon starts off with a mean trick. If you enter with no keys, you have to go to the right and kill some Wizrobes to obtain one. But then, if you decide to open the upper door in that same room, you'll find an old man who will give you a hint on how to kill Gohma, the dungeon boss, but you'll also be left without a key, and you'll have to backtrack to a different dungeon to get another key so you can open the next door to progress. That's extremely cruel. At least progression in this dungeon is mostly linear and doesn't contain too many dead-end rooms to visit. The item you obtain here, the magic wand, acts as a projectile, and combined with another item you get later in the game, can become an upgraded candle. But it's entirely optional, and I didn't find much use for it. I do like the addition of the 3-headed Gleeok mini-boss, and after the pain of Wizrobes, the dungeon boss being the easy orange Gohma is actually a point in its favor. I'd rather have something simple at the end of this hellhole. Still, when I replay this classic game, level 6 will always be my kryptonite. Perhaps you're sensing a theme. The next dungeon on my list is level 3, the Manji. The only other dungeon to have what I consider to be a brutal difficulty spike, and ironically, it could be your first dungeon if you're exploring to the left of the game's first screen. Yikes. It starts off so nice with a few Zols that with the first sword upgrade will die in one hit, otherwise they split into smaller enemies you have to kill instead. But then you reach the 4th room of the dungeon and you're introduced to the brutality of the Dark Nuts. These enemies can only be damaged from the back or the side, and they also happen to be quite tanky. Their AI script feels designed so that when you get close, they swivel in your direction, so really the only safe way to take them on is by using your sword beams. You find them in multiple rooms in the dungeon, and while facing off against 3 of them feels manageable, when you reach the room with 5 of them, and then you go downwards to the room with 8 of them, it's a bit much. At least in the room with the 8, you don't have to fight them, just get to the staircase to obtain the raft needed to access level 4 and backtrack. This dungeon also introduces the bubble enemies, which are by far the most irritating creatures in Zelda 1. Unlike future titles where they slide along the walls, here they just move wherever they want, whenever they want, and if they damage Link, he's stopped from attacking for a few seconds. The game really likes combining them with tough enemies in later dungeons, but even in level 3, I still can't stand them. The entire upper left part of the dungeon can also be skipped with careful positioning, which is always fun, and for people exploring up there, they will find an old man who informs them about a new sword atop a waterfall found in northern Hyrule. I kinda wish that he was at the start of the dungeon though, would have been a nice way to push people out, find that sword upgrade, and then come back and deal with the Dark Nuts. I do like that the old men exist to give hints in the dungeons, but they often end up being used as dead ends, and in later dungeons you have to use keys just to find them. Shout out to this dungeon introducing the iconic boss Manhandler though. Nothing feels better than landing a good bomb and taking out most of the plant heads, and I absolutely loved seeing this boss return in Hyrule Warriors. Unlike the last 2 entries on our list, I have level 5, the Lizard, here at number 7, not because of a difficulty spike that hampered my enjoyment, but because there was nothing in this dungeon that actually excited me in any way. The way to reach the entrance is fun, going up this mountain screen a few times to reveal the way in, but that's where the fun ends. The 2 new enemies we're introduced to are Gibdos, which act as stronger variants of the Stalfos and take more hits to kill, and Pol's Voices, which are some of the most durable enemies if you're attacking them with the sword. They take 3 hits with the fully upgraded sword to defeat, or you can use the bow and arrow to take them down instantly. The issue is that it costs 1 rupee per arrow to use the bow, and in a game where it's a bit tedious to farm for rupees, and in a dungeon that actually has a bomb upgrade for 100 rupees, you don't want to be using them, which makes the Pol's Voices very dangerous to handle. The rest of the enemies are your standard fare: Dark Nuts, Keese, Zols. With a fully upgraded sword, you'll be fine. I feel bad for players who enter any of these later game dungeons and find those rooms that seem to contain 3 Dodongos in them. None of them are required, but you're not gonna know that your first time through. Bombs can be a precious commodity, and it feels lazy and cheap putting a room that will force players to use 6 of their bombs minimum to defeat the challenge within. This dungeon's main item is the recorder, or flute. It's hidden in a part of the dungeon completely unconnected from the main path, so you have to go very out of your way to reach it. The recorder has a few uses, such as overworld travel, which I never ended up using, but its main ability is to defeat the dungeon boss Digdogger. As an old man in the dungeon will hint, Digdogger hates a certain kind of sound, and with the whistle, it will shrink into a smaller variant of itself that you can defeat soundly. It's a gimmick boss fight, but given the limitations of the NES, I think it's a miracle they got as many bosses as they did for this game. And it's the first case in the Zelda series of a dungeon item actually being required to defeat its boss, something that would stick with the series up until Breath of the Wild reinvented the trend. If I can just take a moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and now I'm back from summer break, I know we can do it. Look at how many of you aren't subscribed. So be sure to parry that subscribe button for more gaming countdowns every Wednesday and Saturday. Back to the video. I'm gonna be honest here when I say that level 8, the Lion, as a fully fledged dungeon, is actually quite frustrating. It's filled to the brim with tough enemies, boss rematches, and everything I dislike about The Legend of Zelda's design. Rooms filled with Dark Nuts, Gibdos, and bubbles, making it so you're constantly at risk of losing your ability to attack. 3 manhandlers and 2 blue gomas, one of which is in a room with a series of statues that constantly shoots fireballs. A rather obtuse progression that would definitely leave players not following a guide very confused. On the plus side, there's a hint at the location of the final dungeon from one of the old men. Spectacle Rock is an entrance to death. And for as much as I'm slamming this dungeon, it is nice to overcome it with all of your upgrades and show just how far you've come from the start of your adventure. There are 2 optional dungeon items to obtain, the first being the Book of Magic, which turns the magical rod into a ranged candle, allowing you to light up dark rooms. The other, and perhaps the most useful item, is the magical key, which acts as a skeleton key for every door in the game, allowing you to unlock them all without fail. This has major repercussions for the final dungeon of the game, which we'll touch on later, but it's a powerful optional item and definitely worth seeking out. I also love this dungeon's boss, Gleeok. It's a rematch, but every time you refight him, he always has an extra head, and a 4-headed Gleeok is truly the pinnacle of his power. So defeating him with half a heart left made me feel like an absolute genius. But honestly, aside from nostalgia, level 8 manages to avoid my bottom 3 spots on this list because of its entrance. It's a single tree blocking you from another path further along the screen. It was just begging to be burned down, and since you can buy the blue candle extremely early in the game, you can enter level 8 extremely early in the game. Nothing is more terrifying than burning a random bush in the woodlands near the beginning of the game, expecting a rupee stash or an NPC, only to see the words level 8 appear on the screen, and 2 of the 3 paths lead to a manhandler fight. I just wish level 8 had more of its own identity, as opposed to being a rehash of everything that came before it, and it's also a shame it uses the same color scheme as Death Mountain. The final dungeon deserved to be unique. We're officially out of the woods and into the dungeons I actually like quite a bit. Level 7, the Demon, is up next, and gets a few points right off the bat for being much easier than the previous dungeon in the game, the Dragon. Anything is better than facing rooms filled with countless wizrobes. So to access this dungeon, you actually have to find an abandoned fairy fountain hinted in level 6 by an old man. In the southwest of Hyrule, in the Autumn Forest, you can find a fairy fountain, and on the screen to the left, a fairy fountain with no fairy. Now, I don't know if there's an in-game hint that tells you that using the recorder here will reveal the dungeon entrance, but it's a cool visual and a great way to start the level off. Here you'll find yourself in the Goriah dungeon, filled with the boomerang-throwing enemies, as well as rematches with Digdogger and copious amounts of statues that shoot fireballs. But I find a lot of the fights here pretty fun. If you have full health or you're good at managing your positioning, you can use your sword beam to inflict decent ranged damage on the Goriahs. There are a few rooms with bubbles that I still despise, but not to the extent of some of the other dungeons in the game. However, there is one aspect of this dungeon that does bother me severely, and that is the Hungry Goriah NPC, who will only allow you to pass if you bring him bait. This can be bought at the secret shop where you obtain the blue ring for 60 rupees, but I don't understand how anybody was supposed to figure this out themselves. Are there hints in the game for this interaction? I would love to know. I do like that the dungeon boss is hidden past a secret passage that's hinted by an old man near the start of the dungeon, stating, "There's a secret in the tip of the nose." Even if said dungeon boss is just my precious baby Aquamentus from level 1, but with no change up to his fight or health. The last notable aspect of this dungeon is that it's the location of the second bomb upgrade. This once again costs 100 rupees and is worth purchasing, but I arrived without those rupees needed and had to spend time farming the first few rooms of this dungeon to build up my stash. A part of me wishes the bomb upgrades weren't dungeon exclusive, but I recognize this was the only way to ensure you don't just farm and buy them at the start of the game, and seeing as how you can collect a lot of stuff at the start of the game, I get it. If we're talking nostalgia, we have to discuss Level 1, the Eagle. Found in a gnarled tree stump in the main lake of Hyrule, this is the first ever dungeon to grace our screens, and it does what it needs to do perfectly. It has a simple layout that can be solved without the use of bombs or crazy navigation, gives the player a whole host of simple enemies to fight and overcome, and gives you not one, but 2 dungeon items, one of which is required to complete the game. Yes, you obtain the bow in a hidden room at the northernmost point of the dungeon, and without it, you can't use the silver arrows to defeat Ganon. The enemy variety, as said, is fairly straightforward, with there being Stalfos, who you can one-shot if you get the first sword upgrade, Keese, which I do find annoying, but I can't stay mad since they die in one hit, small gels that also die in one hit and are easy to predict, and then upping the ante in a couple rooms by introducing red Garayas, who have a ranged attack you need to avoid and give you the boomerang as a reward, as well as the room before the boss containing a series of wall masters. I didn't actually trigger them this playthrough, but I have fond memories of being absolutely terrified of them as a kid, as they'll drag you back to the start of the dungeon if you're caught. The old man hint is straightforward, the eastmost peninsula is the secret, hinting at the location of the boss and Triforce Shard, and lets the player know that these old men are here to help, at least in the first quest. Aquamentus is a pretty simple boss, firing 3 fireballs in succession, and you have to strike his horn to defeat him. I have a very big soft spot for this guy's design, and I'd love to see Aquamentus make a return in full 3D fashion. It's criminal that he's only ever appeared outside of this game in Oracle of Seasons. If Gleeok can appear in Tears of the Kingdom, so can my precious baby unicorn dragon. A first dungeon that introduces the concept perfectly, sticks the landing, and remains memorable, deserving of a top 4 finish. While level 1 the Eagle was a perfect starting dungeon, I feel that level 2 the Moon is a perfect escalation. It's not a major step up in difficulty, but has a solid theme and a layout that is easy to navigate and explore, leading it to feel like a comfort dungeon for me in a sense. It's also fairly simple to find, hidden in the north of the Eastern Forest. Here we're introduced to 3 new enemy types: ropes, which are snakes that slide towards you at rapid speed once they hit line of sight, the Moldorms, which are the red worm creatures you can find midway through the dungeon. Small tangent by the way, but the orange sand looks gorgeous against the dark blue hues of the dungeon walls. And there are stone statues that appear for the first time, attacking you with fireballs in the room with the blue Garayas, which is also the room where you get the magic boomerang upgrade, allowing your boomerang to cross an entire screen with ease. It's a bit weird getting an item upgrade so soon after obtaining the boomerang in the last dungeon, but hey, I'm not complaining, it stuns enemies, it's cool. It's safe to say that level 2 is the bomb dungeon of Zelda 1. You can bomb your way from the bottom to the top of the easternmost column of rooms, as well as the left wall of the old man room that hints that Dodongo dislikes smoke. So you can either go through rooms with ropes, Moldorms, and red Garayas, or you can go through rooms with gels, one with blue Garayas, and Keese. Either way, I think this dungeon is fun to explore because it's so easy to see every room. Most of them are connected after all. My only complaint is that the blue enemy sprites blend in with the background slightly. Maybe it's why I like the ropes so much. That yellow on blue, stunning! All of this ends with a pretty simple boss, Dodongo. You place a bomb in his path, he'll eat it and explode, and if you do this twice, bish bash bosh, dungeon done. It cannot be overstated though how important this boss is to the franchise, as a majority of the Zelda games went on to adopt the throw bomb into enemy mouth to do damage adage, with the Frox mini-boss from Tears of the Kingdom being the latest in a long line of examples. The doors that Dodongo opened, we stan. The last of the Triforce Shard dungeons, level 4 the Snake, is our silver medalist. Found on a small island hidden in the southwest portion of Hyrule's Central Lake, you can only reach it by using the raft from level 3. Now, while I'm not the biggest fan of this dungeon's colour, that shade of yellow just does not appeal to me, the dungeon itself is absolutely solid from an exploration point of view, and a difficulty point of view. Here we're introduced to Vyres, who, when attacked, will split into 2 red Keese that also must be killed to finish them off. and we're given our first look at Zelda series classics, likes, which are an infamous enemy that have the ability to consume your shield in both 2D and 3D Zelda games. And given how much the magical shield costs, no, that's terrifying. This dungeon does have a pair of rooms containing bubbles, and I've shared my thoughts on those many times in this video, but luckily the enemies here are fairly weak and slow, so you're not forced to do any crazy movements to avoid the bubbles. I like that this dungeon brings back Manhandler as the mini-boss immediately. Being that it was the main boss of the last dungeon, seeing it around halfway through should come as a shock to the player, and give the sense that things are beginning to ramp up in this game. Here you can find the stepladder dungeon item, which can be used to cross one-tile gaps of water and lava, and is obviously vital for completing the game. You need it to progress the normal way through the dungeon, or you can visit the very obvious secret room on the map and bomb those walls to progress instead. It reminds me of secret rooms from Binding of Isaac. You can see where Binding of Isaac got its inspiration from. It's nice that the game gives you options, ending with a fight against the first appearance of Gleeok with its two-headed variant. As said, I don't need to tell you how iconic Gleeok is to the series now, what with its appearance in Oracle of Seasons, Phantom Hourglass, and now Tears of the Kingdom. I still haven't beaten a King Gleeok, by the way. The way the heads fly around the room when you sever them, becoming moving targets, is genuinely difficult, but not to the point of unfairness. A great way to end a fun dungeon and a solid end to the first half of the game. But it's not my number one. Perhaps this may come as a surprise, given my dungeon ranking so far favors dungeons that have a fair difficulty curve over ones that spam you with tough enemies. But hey, this dungeon literally is shaped like a skull, and it is level 9, Death Mountain. I expect it to be a brutal experience, and I came prepared. I had 2 medicines. Death Mountain is the final dungeon of Zelda 1, and it's over twice the size of the next biggest dungeon, an absolute labyrinth of rooms, many of which are dead ends designed to waste your time. It has its own unique dungeon theme, something Zelda 2 also does with the Great Palace, and it gives a real sense of ominous finality to this dungeon. Now what's fascinating here is how there are 2 entirely different ways of going through the dungeon. If you have the magical key, you can enter all the locked doors immediately, allowing you to take what would be considered a fast track through the dungeon. It's still difficult, but it's fun. Whereas if you didn't collect the magical key, you have to find keys in the dungeon and take a completely different route that involves a lot more bombing walls. And I love that they designed the dungeon in such a way. They accounted for both types of experiences, and yet they're just as difficult as each other. Of course, the whole rogues gallery of enemies makes an appearance: bubbles, wizrobes, darknuts, likes, as well as 2 new enemy types. The Landmola, which is just a larger Moldorm that we'll see again in a future game, and a new mini-boss, Patra. A part of me feels like Patra should have been a boss of an earlier dungeon, maybe level 7 or level 8, because it is easily one of the standout enemies of this game, and the elliptical version that messes with the top-down perspective is a stroke of genius. You have to defeat all 8 smaller heads to harm the large head, and it's just a fun concept. Exploring Death Mountain, there are 2 dungeon items to collect: the optional Red Ring, which boosts Link's defense by 4, and then the not-so-optional and extremely well-hidden Silver Arrows. I absolutely despise the 2-room gauntlet of wizrobes and bubbles just to reach this item, and it's required to beat the boss. Shout out to this one old man, by the way, whose sage advice is just, go to the next room. It's funny, I swear, and it's the only way to get to the left side of the dungeon as far as I can tell. Lastly, let's touch on Ganon. He's honestly a pretty simple final boss when you understand his AI. He always revolves around you in a circle, either clockwise or anti-clockwise, so hitting him is less trial and error, and more just positioning yourself well. With the red ring and a fully upgraded sword, it'll only take a few hits to make him turn brown, where you can shoot him with a silver arrow and end the beast. It has more thought put into it than some of the bosses, and I can appreciate that. Just don't be that one guy who ends this fight with half a heart. enters the next room and then accidentally dies to the fire around Princess Zelda. I know there are people who have done it before, and if any of you are watching, I really hope you're doing okay. Death Mountain is my favorite dungeon from the original Legend of Zelda, and its brutality feels mostly fair. I still fucking hate blue Wizrobes. And that's my list. Which Zelda NES dungeon is your favorite and least favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Next Saturday, I'll be ranking every enemy from the NES Legend of Zelda from worst to best, but once again, keep in mind I'm only focusing on the first quest. If you ever want to see me tackle the secret second quest, also known as this game's hard mode, parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on my future videos, and be sure to let me know. My social links are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I'd recommend my Twitter or Blue Sky if you have access to it. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting me for another month, you guys are so worth it. And I'll see you guys next time. Adios.